My name is Margaret, and I'm 32 years old. I never thought a simple family reunion would change everything between my mother and me forever. For years, I'd been the responsible older daughter, always trying to keep the peace while watching my younger sister Emily get all the praise and attention. But that Sunday afternoon at my grandmother's house, when my mother looked me straight in the eye in front of all our relatives and said those words that cut deeper than any knife ever could, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Something inside me just snapped, and for the first time in my life, I decided to tell the truth about everything. Before I share what happened that day, let me know where you're watching from, and please hit that like button. You won't believe how this family gathering ended, and what secrets came tumbling out when I finally found my voice. Growing up in our household meant understanding that there were two very different sets of rules. I was the eldest daughter, born when my parents Helen and Robert were just 23 years old and still figuring out how to be adults themselves. My mother always expected more from me because I was the first child, the one who had to set an example. I learned to tie my shoes earlier, read chapter books before kindergarten, and help with household chores while other kids my age were still playing with toys. Then Emily came along 5 years later, and suddenly everything changed. Where I had been expected to excel and behave perfectly, Emily was celebrated simply for existing. She had these bright blue eyes and golden curls that everyone in our extended family just adored. At family gatherings, relatives would rush to pinch her cheeks and comment on how beautiful she was, while I stood quietly nearby, already too serious for my age. My mother Helen worked as a receptionist at a dental office, and my father Robert was a mechanic who worked long hours at the local garage. Money was always tight, but somehow there was always enough for Emily's dance classes, piano lessons, and the pretty dresses she wanted. When I asked for art supplies or books, I was told we needed to be more practical with our spending. In school, I threw myself into academics because that seemed to be the only way I could get any recognition at home. I made honor roll every semester, joined the debate team, and volunteered at the local library on weekends. But when I brought home my report cards, my mother would glance at them briefly and say something like, "That's nice, Margaret," before turning her attention back to Emily's latest crayon drawing that she'd already taped to the refrigerator. Emily, on the other hand, was naturally social and charming. She made friends easily, got invited to birthday parties every weekend, and had teachers who called home just to tell my parents how delightful she was in class. My mother would beam with pride during these phone calls, telling anyone who would listen about Emily's latest achievement or cute thing she said. The pattern continued through high school. I graduated as valedictorian and earned a partial scholarship to the state university where I studied accounting. Emily barely scraped by with C's and D's, but my mother would make excuses for her, saying she was just more of a people person than an academic type. When Emily decided she wanted to go to cosmetology school instead of college, my mother supported her completely, saying that beauty was a valuable skill and Emily had natural talent. I met David during my junior year of college. He was studying business administration and seemed steady, reliable, and kind. We dated for 2 years before getting married in a small ceremony at our local church. My mother spent most of the wedding planning period suggesting ways we could save money and scale things back, but when Emily got engaged 3 years later, suddenly no expense was too great for her baby's special day. David and I moved to a modest apartment across town where we both worked hard to build our careers. I got a job at a small accounting firm, and David started working at a marketing company. We were happy for the first few years, talking about our dreams of buying a house and starting a family. When our daughter Sophie was born 7 years ago, I thought maybe finally becoming a grandmother would help my mother see me in a different light. But even with Sophie, the favoritism continued. When Emily's first boyfriend brought flowers to meet the family, my mother gushed about how romantic he was. When David brought flowers for our anniversary, she commented that it seemed like a waste of money. When Sophie took her first steps at 11 months old, my mother mentioned that Emily had walked at 10 months. When Sophie said her first word, my mother reminded everyone that Emily had been talking in complete sentences by 18 months. The cracks in my marriage started showing about 3 years ago, but I kept trying to hold everything together. David was working longer hours, coming home later, and seemed distracted even when he was physically present. I blamed stress from his job and tried to be more supportive, taking on more of the household responsibilities and childcare duties. When he started going on more business trips, I didn't question it because because I trusted him completely. My mother, meanwhile, continued to hold up Emily as the golden child. Emily had finished cosmetology school and was working at an upscale salon in the city. She lived in a trendy apartment, drove a newer car than mine, and seemed to have endless money for clothes and weekend trips. Whenever we had family dinners, my mother would spend the entire time asking Emily about her exciting life while I sat quietly, helping serve food and clean up afterward. The breaking point in my marriage came 8 months ago, but the foundation had been crumbling for much longer than I wanted to admit. The morning of our annual family reunion started with the same nervous energy I'd felt every year for the past decade. These gatherings at my grandmother's house had become increasingly difficult for me, but I couldn't bear the thought of Sophie missing out on time with her great-grandmother, who was 89 years old and still sharp as a tack. I spent extra time getting Sophie ready, braiding her long brown hair, and making sure her favorite dress was wrinkle-free. She was 7 years old now and had inherited my serious nature, though she still had moments of pure childhood joy that made my heart sing. As we drove the 45 minutes to my grandmother's house, Sophie chatted excitedly about seeing her cousins and playing in the big backyard. My grandmother's house was a 2-story colonial that had been in our family for over 60 years. The white paint was starting to peel around the window frames, but the large front porch with its hanging swings still looked welcoming. Cars were already lining the circular driveway when we arrived, which meant Emily and most of our aunts and uncles had beaten us there. Walking through the front door, I was immediately hit with the familiar smells of my grandmother's cooking and the sound of multiple conversations happening at once. My Aunt Patricia was setting up folding chairs in the living room while my Uncle Vernon helped move furniture to make more space. Cousins were running between rooms and babies were crying from various corners of the house. My grandmother, who everyone called Nana, greeted Sophie and me with warm hugs and insisted on showing Sophie the new bird feeder she'd installed outside the kitchen window. Nana had always been the one person in our family who treated all her grandchildren equally, and I treasured the genuine affection in her eyes when she looked at Sophie. "Margaret, honey, you look tired," Nana said, studying my face with concern. "Are you getting enough sleep?" Before I could answer, my mother's voice cut through the room. "Oh, there's Margaret. Emily's been here for an hour already, helping me get everything ready." I turned to see my mother Helen standing in the doorway between the living room and kitchen, wearing the blue dress she saved for special occasions. At 57, she was still an attractive woman with graying hair that she kept perfectly styled. Her smile was bright, but it didn't quite reach her eyes when she looked at me. "Sorry we're a little late," I said, keeping my voice pleasant. "Sophie wanted to bring a drawing she made for Nana." "How thoughtful," my mother replied, but she was already looking past me toward the kitchen where Emily's laughter could be heard. "Emily brought homemade cookies. She's gotten so good at baking since she moved in with Ryan." Ryan was Emily's boyfriend of 8 months. A real estate agent who drove an expensive car and wore suits that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I'd met him twice at family dinners, and while he seemed nice enough, there was something about the way he dominated conversations that made me uncomfortable. As if summoned by our conversation, Emily appeared in the doorway with Ryan close behind her. At 27, Emily had grown into the beauty everyone had predicted she'd become. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders, and she had the kind of effortless style that made everything she wore look expensive. Ryan was tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of confident smile that suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room. "Maggie?" Emily exclaimed, using the childhood nickname that only she was allowed to use. She gave me a quick hug that smelled like expensive perfume. "I was wondering when you'd get here." Ryan was just telling everyone about the house we're looking at. "A house?" I asked, trying to keep the surprise out of my voice. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, 2-car garage, Ryan said, launching into what sounded like a practiced sales pitch. "Emily deserves the best, and I plan to give it to her." My mother beamed. "Isn't that wonderful? Emily's finally found someone who knows how to treat a woman right." The comment hit like a small slap, but I'd learned over the years to let these things slide. Instead, I focused on getting Sophie settled with her cousins and helping my aunts finish setting up for lunch. The dining room table had been extended with 2 card tables to accommodate everyone, and my grandmother's good china was laid out carefully. I found myself automatically falling into the role I'd played at every family gathering, helping serve food, refilling drinks, and making sure everyone else was comfortable before thinking about my own needs. Lunch conversation revolved around Emily's job at the salon, Ryan's latest real estate deals, and their plans for the future. My mother hung on every word, asking follow-up questions and offering enthusiastic commentary. When my Aunt Joan asked about my work at the accounting firm, I barely got through describing a recent project before my mother redirected the conversation back to Emily's latest client, who was apparently some minor local celebrity. I watched Sophie picking at her food and tried to engage her in conversation, but even she seemed to sense the tension in the room. She was a perceptive child who noticed when people treated her mother differently, and I could see her starting to withdraw into the quiet, observant mode that reminded me painfully of my own childhood. After lunch, while the men gathered in the living room to watch football and the women cleaned up in the kitchen, I found myself standing at the sink washing dishes while Emily and my mother sat at the kitchen table looking through real estate listings on Ryan's phone. "This one has a beautiful master suite," my mother said, pointing at the screen. "And look at that kitchen island. You could do so much entertaining in a space like this. Ryan thinks we should wait until we find something with a pool," Emily replied. "He says it's important to think about resale value." I scrubbed the casserole dish harder than necessary and tried to focus on the practical task at hand rather than the growing knot of resentment in my stomach. After the lunch dishes were cleared and put away, the entire extended family gathered in my grandmother's spacious living room. This was the traditional part of our family reunions where everyone would catch up properly, share news, and enjoy each other's company. The older relatives claimed the comfortable chairs and sofas, while the younger cousins sprawled on the carpet, and the middle generation found spots wherever they could. I settled into a corner chair with Sophie curled up beside me, her head resting against my shoulder. She'd been unusually quiet since we arrived, and I could tell she was picking up on the undercurrents of tension that always seemed to swirl around these family gatherings when my mother was in one of her moods. My mother positioned herself in the center of the main sofa, with Emily and Ryan flanked on either side of her like some kind of royal court. She was clearly in her element, holding court and ready to share all of Emily's latest accomplishments with our captive audience of aunts, uncles, and cousins. "You all have to hear about Emily's promotion at the salon," my mother began, her voice carrying the kind of pride that I'd spent 32 years hoping to hear directed at me. "Tell them about the celebrity client, sweetheart." Emily launched into a story about styling hair for a local news anchor, and my mother interjected with additional details every few sentences, making the story sound more glamorous with each embellishment. I watched my relatives nod and smile politely, offering the appropriate responses at the right moments. "And the money she's making now," my mother continued when Emily finished her story. "I never imagined someone could do so well in the beauty industry. She's always been so talented with hair and makeup, even as a little girl." My Aunt Patricia, who had always been kind to me, tried to steer the conversation in a different direction. "Margaret, how's Sophie doing in school? She's gotten so tall since Christmas." Before I could answer, my mother jumped in. "Oh, Sophie's fine, second grade, you know, nothing too exciting there. But Emily, tell everyone about the wedding plans." I felt Sophie tense against my side. At 7 years old, she was old enough to understand that her grandmother consistently dismissed anything related to our lives while celebrating everything about her Aunt Emily. I rubbed Sophie's arm gently, trying to provide some comfort while keeping my own emotions in check. "We're thinking about a destination wedding," Emily said, glancing at Ryan with what looked like genuine happiness. "Maybe somewhere tropical. Ryan has some contacts in the travel industry who could help us plan something really special." "Imagine that," my mother said, clasping her hands together. "My baby girl getting married on a beach somewhere beautiful. Emily always did have expensive taste, but she's worth every penny." The comment about expensive taste was clearly directed at me, a not-so-subtle reference to my modest wedding 8 years ago that had been planned on a tight budget. David and I had wanted a simple ceremony focused on our commitment to each other, rather than an elaborate production, but my mother had made several comments over the years about how we could have done better if we'd tried harder. My Uncle Harold, who was usually good at reading room dynamics, attempted to include me in the conversation. "Margaret, are you still enjoying your work at the accounting firm? I remember you mentioning some interesting projects last year." "It's been busy," I started to say, but my mother was already shaking her head. "Accounting is so," she paused, as if searching for a diplomatic word, "practical. I mean, it's steady work, which is important when you're a single mother, but it's not exactly glamorous like what Emily does. The words single mother hung in the air like an accusation. My mother had a way of making my divorce status sound like a personal failing, as if I'd somehow chosen to end up raising Sophie alone. The fact that she brought it up in front of our entire extended family felt deliberately cruel. Sophie shifted uncomfortably beside me, and I could see several of my relatives exchanging glances. Even they seemed to recognize that my mother's comment had crossed a line, but nobody said anything. This was how it had always been in our family. Everyone was too polite or too afraid to call out my mother's obvious favoritism. Both my grandmother said from her chair by the window, "I think both my granddaughters are doing just fine. They're both working hard and raising themselves up in the world." I shot Nana a grateful look, but my mother wasn't deterred. "Of course they're both fine," she said with a wave of her hand, "but there's a difference between fine and thriving. Emily is thriving. She's found a career she loves, a man who adores her, and she's building the kind of life every mother dreams of for her daughter." The implication was crystal clear. I was not thriving, had not found the right career or kept the right man, and was not building the kind of life she dreamed of for me. I felt my cheeks burning with embarrassment and anger, but I'd spent so many years learning to swallow these kinds of comments that staying silent had become second nature. Ryan, perhaps sensing the awkwardness, tried to change the subject by asking my Uncle Vernon about his recent retirement from the post office, but my mother was on a roll now, energized by having a captive audience for her praise of Emily and her subtle criticism of my life choices. "The thing about Emily," she continued, apparently unable to let the topic drop, "is that she's always been smart about relationships. She knows how to make a man feel appreciated and valued. Some women never learn that skill." Sophie looked up at me with confused, hurt eyes. She might not have understood all the adult implications, but she knew her grandmother was saying mean things about her mother. I squeezed her hand and gave her what I hoped was a reassuring smile. Even though my heart was pounding with suppressed anger, Emily, to her credit, looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Mom, maybe we should talk about something else," she said quietly. "Oh, I'm just proud of you, sweetheart," my mother replied. "Is it wrong for a mother to be proud of her daughter's success?" The emphasis on her daughter's success made it clear that she was talking about one daughter specifically, not both of us. I felt something dark and bitter rising in my chest, years of accumulated hurt and resentment threatening to spill over. The tension in the room was becoming impossible to ignore, but my mother seemed oblivious to the discomfort she was causing. If anything, she appeared to be gaining momentum, feeding off the awkward energy and the attention from our relatives, who were clearly trapped in an uncomfortable situation. "You know what I've always admired about Emily," my mother continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when she was about to make what she considered a profound observation. "She's never been afraid to go after what she wants. When she decided she wanted to work in the beauty industry, she threw herself into it completely. When she met Ryan, she didn't play games or try to be someone she wasn't. She just let herself be lovable." The word lovable hit me like a physical blow. The implication was obvious. Emily was naturally lovable, while I apparently was not. I could feel my relatives shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and even my usually diplomatic Aunt Joan was starting to look annoyed with my mother's behavior. Sophie had gone completely still beside me, and I realized she was holding her breath. At 7 years old, she was absorbing every word of this conversation, learning lessons about family dynamics and self-worth that would stay with her for years to come. The thought of my daughter internalizing these messages about her mother's supposed failures made my protective instincts flare to life. "Helen," my grandmother said sharply, using the tone that had commanded respect from 3 generations of our family, "I think that's enough for now." But my mother was too caught up in her performance to heed the warning. She turned to Emily with an expression of pure maternal adoration that I'd seen countless times but had never been directed at me. "I just look at Emily and Ryan together, and I see exactly what I always hoped for," she said. "A daughter who knows how to build a stable, loving relationship. A daughter who makes smart choices about her future. A daughter who," she paused dramatically, "who makes her mother proud every single day." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the room understood the contrast she was drawing. If Emily was the daughter who made smart choices and built stable relationships, then I was obviously the daughter who had failed on both counts. If Emily made her proud every day, then I was the source of disappointment and embarrassment. I felt tears starting to sting my eyes, but I blinked them back fiercely. I would not give my mother the satisfaction of seeing me cry in front of our entire family. I would not let Sophie see her mother reduced to tears by her grandmother's cruelty. Emily was staring at her hands, her face flushed with embarrassment. Ryan looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. My aunts and uncles were studying the carpet, the ceiling, anything except the painful family drama unfolding in front of them. "Mom," Emily said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please stop." "Stop what?" my mother asked with exaggerated innocence. "Stop being proud of my daughter. Stop appreciating the choices she's made. Stop being grateful that at least one of my children knows how to build a life worth celebrating." The phrase, "at least one of my children," was the final straw. I felt something shift inside me. A wall of patience and tolerance that had been built up over 32 years, suddenly cracking under the pressure of too many insults, too many comparisons, too many years of being made to feel like the inferior daughter. I was about to speak, to finally defend myself after decades of silence, when my mother delivered the blow that would change everything between us forever. She turned to look directly at me, her eyes bright with what looked almost like satisfaction, and spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear clearly. "Sometimes I wish I only gave birth to your sister." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I felt the blood drain from my face as the full impact of what she'd just said hit me. My own mother, in front of our entire extended family, had just told me she wished I had never been born. Sophie gasped audibly and turned to look at me with wide, frightened eyes. She might not have understood all the implications, but she knew her grandmother had just said something terrible about her mother. I saw tears starting to well up in her eyes, and something primal and fierce awakened in me. The room was completely silent. Even the cousins playing in the corner had stopped their games and were staring at us. My mother sat back in her chair with an expression that looked almost satisfied, as if she'd finally said what she'd been thinking for years. Emily's face had gone pale, and she was staring at our mother with what looked like horror. "Mom," she whispered, "you can't say things like that." "I can say whatever I want," my mother replied coolly. "It's my house, my family, and my truth. I'm tired of pretending that both my daughters have been equally successful or equally satisfying as children. Emily has given me nothing but joy and pride. Margaret has given me nothing but worry and disappointment." I stood up slowly, my legs shaking but my resolve growing stronger with each second. Sophie scrambled to stay close to me, wrapping her arms around my waist as if she could protect me from her grandmother's words. I looked around the room at the faces of my relatives, some shocked, some embarrassed, some angry on my behalf. For the first time in my adult life, I realized I had absolutely nothing left to lose. My mother had just publicly declared that she wished I didn't exist. There was no relationship left to preserve, no peace left to keep, no reason to continue protecting the family secrets that had kept me silent for so long. I took a deep breath and felt something that had been locked away inside me for 8 months finally breaking free. It was time to tell the truth about everything. I stood there in my grandmother's living room, my daughter's arms wrapped around my waist, looking at my mother's smug expression, and feeling 32 years of suppressed anger crystallize into perfect clarity. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady when I finally spoke. "You want to talk about disappointment, Mom?" I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You want to talk about who's been a failure as a daughter? Let me tell you some truths about your precious perfect family that maybe everyone here should know." My mother's confident expression flickered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Margaret, don't you dare try to turn this around on me. Everyone here can see the difference between you and your sister." "You're absolutely right," I said, feeling a strange sense of calm settling over me. "There is a huge difference between Emily and me. The difference is that I've been protecting this family's reputation for 8 months while you've been spreading lies about why my marriage ended." I could see confusion starting to creep into my mother's eyes, but I wasn't finished. Not even close. "You want to know why David and I got divorced, Mom? You want to know the real reason your disappointment of a daughter couldn't keep her husband happy? The room was so quiet I could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Every person in that room was hanging on my words, probably expecting me to confess to some failure that would justify my mother's treatment of me. David was having an affair, I said, letting each word drop like a stone into still water. For 2 years he was sleeping with his secretary, a 24-year-old named Jessica who drove a red convertible and wore skirts short enough to stop traffic. I heard my Aunt Patricia gasp softly, and I saw my Uncle Harold's face harden with anger on my behalf. But I kept my eyes focused on my mother, watching as the smugness slowly drained from her expression. I found out when Jessica called our house by mistake one night, thinking she was calling David's cell phone. She was drunk and started talking about their weekend plans before she realized she was talking to his wife. I spent the next 6 months trying to save our marriage, going to counseling by myself because David refused to go, taking on extra responsibilities at home so he wouldn't feel stressed, even agreeing to couples therapy when he finally admitted what he'd done. Sophie was looking up at me with wide eyes, hearing details about her father that I'd shielded her from for months. I smoothed her hair gently, trying to give her some comfort while I continued my story. But David had already decided he wanted his new life more than he wanted our family. He moved in with Jessica 3 days after our divorce was finalized. They got engaged 2 weeks later. I turned to look at my mother directly, seeing confusion and the first hints of guilt starting to creep across her features. So when you told Mrs. Henderson from next door that your daughter just couldn't keep her husband satisfied, you were talking about a woman who had spent 2 years trying to hold together a marriage while her husband was building a whole other life with someone else. When you told Aunt Patricia that I must not have been trying hard enough to make David happy, you were talking about a woman who was going to marriage counseling alone and crying herself to sleep every night. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see my relatives processing this information, understanding for the first time that everything they'd assumed about my divorce had been wrong. My grandmother was looking at my mother with an expression I'd never seen before. Pure disappointment. "Margaret," my mother said, her voice much smaller than it had been moments before, "why didn't you tell me?" I let out a laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. "Tell you? When exactly was I supposed to tell you, Mom?" During one of our conversations where you spent the entire time talking about how wonderful Emily is, or maybe during one of the family dinners where you compared me to her for 2 straight hours. Or perhaps I should have mentioned it when you were telling everyone who would listen that I obviously didn't know how to be a good wife. I could feel Sophie trembling against me, and I realized I needed to be careful about how much anger I let show. She was already scared and confused by this whole situation, and I didn't want to make it worse for her. The truth is, Mom, I kept quiet about David's affair because I was trying to protect Sophie from having to hear ugly details about her father. I was trying to protect our family from gossip and drama. And yes, I was trying to protect you from the embarrassment of having people know that your daughter's husband chose another woman over his family. I paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing with the most painful part of my story. But every single time you made a comment about my failed marriage, every time you suggested that I just wasn't good enough to keep a man happy, every time you held up Emily as the example of how relationships should work, you were twisting the knife a little deeper. You were taking the worst thing that had ever happened to me and making it my fault. My mother's face had gone completely pale, and I could see tears starting to form in her eyes, but I wasn't finished. 8 months of pain and humiliation had built up inside me, and now that the dam had burst, everything was going to come flooding out. You want to know what the worst part was? I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. The worst part was that while I was dealing with my husband's betrayal and trying to figure out how to explain to Sophie why Daddy wasn't coming home anymore, my own mother was telling anyone who would listen that it was probably my fault, that maybe if I'd been more like Emily, I could have saved my marriage. I saw Emily flinch at the mention of her name, and I realized it was time to share the other truth that had been eating away at me for months. The truth that would finally show everyone exactly what kind of perfect daughter my mother had been praising all this time. I looked at Emily sitting on the couch next to our mother, her face pale and her hands twisted together in her lap. She'd been silent through my revelations about David's affair, but I could see in her eyes that she knew what was coming next. The secret that she'd been carrying for 8 months was about to be exposed, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But here's the thing about secrets, Mom. I said, my voice gaining strength as I prepared to reveal the final piece of the puzzle. They have a way of coming out eventually, especially when you're building someone up as perfect while tearing someone else down. Emily was shaking her head slightly, a desperate look in her eyes. Margaret, please, she whispered. But I was past the point of protecting anyone's feelings. My mother had just told me she wished I'd never been born, in front of our entire family. The time for keeping secrets to preserve other people's comfort was over. Emily knew about David's affair 6 months before I found out, I said, watching as the shock rippled through the room. She met Jessica at a restaurant downtown when she was having lunch with one of her clients. Jessica was bragging to her friend about sleeping with a married man, showing off pictures on her phone of the expensive gifts he was buying her. Pictures that included photos of David. My mother's mouth fell open, and she turned to stare at Emily with confusion and disbelief. Emily was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized her carefully constructed image was about to crumble. Emily recognized David immediately, I continued, feeling no satisfaction in watching my sister fall apart, but knowing that the truth needed to be told. She even heard Jessica mention his name and talk about his wife and daughter who had no idea what was going on. But instead of telling me what she'd learned, Emily decided to keep quiet about it. That's not, Emily started, but her voice broke and she couldn't finish the sentence. It gets worse, I said, turning back to my mother. 3 months before I found out about the affair, Emily actually went out for drinks with David. He called her, said he needed to talk to someone in the family about marriage problems, and convinced her to meet him at a bar across town. I could see the horror dawning in my mother's eyes as she began to understand just how deep Emily's deception had gone. David spent 2 hours telling Emily all about Jessica, about how he was planning to leave me, about how he'd already started looking for an apartment. He made Emily promise not to tell me because he wanted to find the right time to break the news. Emily agreed to keep his secret. The room was completely silent except for Emily's quiet crying and the sound of my grandmother's shocked breathing. Even Sophie had gone completely still, sensing that something momentous was happening, even if she didn't understand all the details. So while I was at home with Sophie, planning our family vacation and trying to figure out why David seemed so distant, Emily was keeping the secret that my husband was about to destroy our family, while I was lying awake at night wondering what I'd done wrong to make David pull away from me. Emily knew exactly what was happening and chose to say nothing. I turned to look directly at Emily, feeling a mixture of anger and pity for my sister. And then, after David finally left and I was struggling to rebuild my life as a single mother, Emily sat at family dinners and listened to Mom praise her for being so good at relationships. She listened to Mom compare us and suggest that maybe if I'd been more like Emily, I could have kept my husband happy. Emily was sobbing openly now, her perfect composure completely shattered. I'm sorry, she choked out. I wanted to tell you, but David said he needed time to figure things out, and I thought maybe they could work it out, and I didn't want to hurt you if it wasn't necessary. But it was necessary, I said, my voice gentle but firm, because while you were protecting David's timeline for destroying my marriage, I was wasting months of my life trying to save something that was already over. While you were keeping his secret, I was blaming myself for problems I didn't even know existed. I turned back to my mother, who was staring at Emily as if she'd never seen her before. The daughter she'd held up as the perfect example of how to live was revealed to be someone who had participated in the deception that destroyed her sister's marriage. But wait, I said, realizing I wasn't quite finished with my revelations. There's more you should know about Emily's perfect life, Mom. Since we're being honest about everything. Emily's head snapped up, panic clear in her eyes. Margaret, don't, she pleaded. Ryan isn't divorced like he told everyone, I said, watching my mother's face carefully. He's separated from his wife, but they're not legally divorced yet. They're in the middle of a custody battle over their 2 kids, and his wife has been fighting the divorce because she wants to try to save their marriage. My mother's face went completely white. Emily, is this true? Emily couldn't speak through her tears, but her silence was answer enough. Ryan's been telling Emily that the divorce will be final any day now, but I did some research online after the last family dinner. His separation started 8 months ago, right around the time he started dating Emily. His wife posted on social media about trying to save their marriage and asking for prayers to bring her husband home to their children. I could see my mother struggling to process this information, trying to reconcile the image of Emily's perfect relationship with the reality that she was dating a man who was still legally married and might be planning to return to his family, and those expensive gifts Ryan keeps buying Emily, the fancy dinners and weekend trips. He's paying for all of that with credit cards because his wife froze their joint bank accounts. Emily knows this because Ryan told her last week that he might need to borrow money from her to pay his lawyer fees. The golden couple that my mother had been holding up as the example of relationship success was revealed to be built on lies, financial instability, and a man who was still married to someone else. Emily was crying so hard now that she could barely breathe, and even Ryan looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. My mother sat frozen on the couch, staring at both of her daughters as if she'd never really seen either of us before. The living room had become a tableau of shock and devastation. My mother sat motionless on the couch, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, horror, and what might have been the first stirrings of guilt. Emily was crying into her hands, her perfect facade completely shattered. Ryan looked like he was calculating the fastest route to the front door. And around the room, my aunts, uncles, and cousins sat in stunned silence, processing the complete reversal of everything they thought they knew about our family dynamics. My grandmother was the first person to break the silence. At 89 years old, she'd seen enough family drama to recognize a moment that would define relationships for years to come. "Margaret," she said, her voice gentle but clear, "come here, sweetheart." I walked over to her chair, still holding Sophie's hand. My grandmother reached up and took my free hand in both of hers. Her skin paper thin, but her grip surprisingly strong. "I owe you an apology," she said, looking directly into my eyes. "We all do. I've watched your mother treat you unfairly for years, and I should have said something long before today. I should have stood up for you when you were too polite to stand up for yourself." I felt tears finally starting to spill over, not from sadness, but from the relief of finally being seen and understood by someone in my family. "You've been carrying all of this pain by yourself," Nana continued, "protecting everyone else's feelings while your own heart was breaking. That's not fair, and it's not right, and I'm ashamed that I let it go on for so long." My Aunt Patricia stood up from her chair and walked over to us. "Your grandmother's right, Margaret. I've been uncomfortable with Helen's treatment of you for years, but I kept telling myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I'm sorry for that." One by one, my other relatives began to speak up. My Uncle Harold expressed his anger about how I'd been treated. My Aunt Joan apologized for not defending me when my mother made her cutting comments. Even some of my younger cousins, who I'd thought weren't paying attention to the adult dynamics, told me they'd noticed the unfairness and felt bad about it. Through all of this, my mother remained silent, staring at her hands as if she couldn't bear to look at anyone in the room. Emily had stopped crying but was still curled up on the couch, looking smaller and younger than her 27 years. "Helen," my grandmother said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone that had commanded respect for decades, "I think you have something to say to your daughter." My mother finally looked up, and I could see that she was crying too. But I wasn't ready to accept an apology yet. Not when I'd spent 8 months listening to her blame me for my marriage's failure while she unknowingly defended the people who had betrayed me. "You don't get to cry now, Mom," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. "You don't get to act like this is surprising or like you had no idea what you were doing to me." "Margaret, I didn't know about David," she said, her voice pleading. "If I had known what really happened, but you should have asked," I interrupted. "When your daughter's marriage fell apart, your first instinct should have been to support her, not to assume she was at fault. You should have wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story than what appeared on the surface." I could see Sophie looking up at me with something that might have been pride, and I realized that standing up for myself was teaching her something important about self-respect and boundaries. "Instead, you decided that Emily was the good daughter, and I was the disappointment, and you treated us accordingly for 8 months. You made comments about my failed marriage at every family gathering. You suggested to our relatives and neighbors that I must not have been a good enough wife. You held up Emily as the example of how relationships should work, never once considering that maybe Emily's relationship wasn't as perfect as it appeared." My mother was crying harder now, but I wasn't finished. "And today, in front of our entire family, you told me you wished I had never been born. You said that to your daughter, Mom. You said it in front of your granddaughter. What exactly did you think was going to happen after that? Did you think I was just going to sit there and take it like I have for the past 32 years? I took a deep breath, feeling some of the anger finally starting to drain away and leaving behind a strange sense of liberation. I'm done protecting your feelings at the expense of my own self-respect. I'm done letting you treat me like the family failure while you praise Emily for a life that was built on lies and secrets. And I'm done letting Sophie watch her grandmother treat her mother like she's worthless. I looked around the room at all the faces of my family members, seeing a mixture of support, guilt, and understanding in their expressions. I'm going to take Sophie home now, I said, my voice calm and final. We're going to go back to our little apartment where we've been building a good life together despite everything that's happened to us. And we're going to be just fine without the drama and the comparisons and the constant reminders that we're not good enough for this family. I started to turn toward the door, but my mother's voice stopped me. Margaret, please, she said, standing up from the couch. Don't leave like this. Let me apologize properly. Let me try to fix this. I turned back to look at her, seeing genuine remorse in her eyes for the first time in years. But I also knew that some things couldn't be fixed with a simple apology, especially when the damage had been building for decades. Mom, I said gently, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about today. This isn't just about one horrible comment or one unfair comparison. This is about 32 years of being made to feel like I'm not as valuable as Emily. This is about a lifetime of being the responsible one who never gets credit, the hard worker who never gets praise, the daughter who does everything right but somehow still isn't enough. I could see her struggling to process this, to understand that her favoritism hadn't been as subtle as she'd thought. Maybe someday we can have a real conversation about all of this, I continued. Maybe someday you'll be ready to acknowledge that you've treated your daughters very differently, and that it's caused real damage to our relationship, but that conversation isn't going to happen today, and it's not going to happen until you're ready to take real responsibility for your actions. With that, I took Sophie's hand and walked toward the front door, leaving behind the shocked silence of my family and carrying with me the strange, wonderful feeling of finally having told my truth. 6 months have passed since that devastating family reunion, and I'm sitting in my small but cozy apartment, watching Sophie practice piano on the old upright we found at a yard sale last month. The afternoon sunlight streams through our living room window, highlighting the framed pictures of Sophie's artwork that cover one entire wall. This place might not be the 4-bedroom house with the 2-car garage that Emily and Ryan were planning, but it's ours, and it's filled with peace in a way my life hadn't been for years. The weeks immediately following the confrontation were difficult in ways I hadn't expected. After spending so many years keeping family secrets and maintaining relationships at any cost, suddenly having everything out in the open felt both liberating and terrifying. I'd finally told my truth, but I wasn't sure what came next. Emily called me 3 days after the reunion, crying and apologizing for over an hour. She confessed that keeping David's secret had been eating away at her for months, but she'd been too afraid to tell me the truth because she didn't want to hurt me even more than David already had. It was misguided logic, but I could understand her motivation, even if I couldn't forgive her actions immediately. The conversation revealed something else I hadn't expected. Emily admitted that she'd always felt pressure to be the perfect daughter because she'd seen how critically our mother judged me. She'd been performing happiness and success, partly because she was terrified of falling out of favor the way I had. In trying to avoid our mother's disappointment, she'd made choices that ultimately hurt both of us. We've been talking regularly since then, slowly rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than the competition our mother had fostered between us. Emily broke up with Ryan 2 weeks after the reunion when she finally acknowledged that their relationship was built on his lies about his divorce. She's been going to therapy to work through her people-pleasing tendencies and her fear of disappointing others. My mother has reached out several times, leaving voicemails and sending cards with lengthy apologies. Last month, she even showed up at my apartment with flowers and tears, begging for a chance to make things right. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet, but I didn't slam the door in her face either. Progress, I suppose. The biggest change has been in myself. 3 months ago, I started seeing a therapist who specializes in family dynamics and self-worth issues. Dr. Sarah Chen has helped me understand that my mother's favoritism wasn't a reflection of my value as a person, but rather a dysfunction in her ability to love her children equally. It's helped me process 32 years of feeling like I wasn't good enough, and begin building a sense of self-worth that doesn't depend on other people's approval. I also made a career change that I'd been considering for years but had been too afraid to attempt. I left the accounting firm and started my own bookkeeping business, working with small local businesses who need someone reliable and trustworthy to manage their finances. It's challenging and sometimes stressful, but it's mine in a way that working for someone else never was. Sophie loves that I work from home now and can pick her up from school every day. The most unexpected development came from my grandmother. 2 months ago, Nana asked if Sophie and I would like to move into her house and help her with daily tasks in exchange for reduced rent. At 89, she's still sharp and independent, but she admits she feels more secure having family nearby. Sophie was thrilled at the prospect of living in the big house with the wraparound porch and helping care for her great-grandmother. We moved in last month, and it's been wonderful for both Sophie and me. Sophie has space to run and play, and she's learning valuable lessons about caring for elderly family members. I've found peace in the house where my grandmother has always treated me with equal love and respect, and Nana seems to have found new energy in having a 7-year-old around to keep her on her toes. The relationship with my mother remains complicated. She's made genuine efforts to change, including starting therapy herself to explore why she developed such obvious favoritism toward Emily. She's sent Sophie birthday gifts and school supplies without making any comparisons to other children. She's asked about my business with what seems like genuine interest rather than looking for ways to suggest I should be doing something else. But trust, once broken so thoroughly, takes time to rebuild. I'm not ready to pretend that 32 years of emotional damage can be healed with a few months of better behavior. Some of my relatives have suggested that I should forgive and forget, move past the hurt for the sake of family unity. But I've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean accepting poor treatment, and family unity that requires me to suppress my own needs isn't really unity at all. Sophie has been remarkably resilient through all of these changes. She's old enough to understand that sometimes adults make mistakes and hurt each other's feelings, but young enough to adapt to new living arrangements and family dynamics without carrying too much emotional baggage. She asks occasional questions about why Grandma Helen said those mean things, and I try to give her age-appropriate answers that help her understand without making her afraid of family relationships. The most important lesson I want Sophie to learn from this experience is that she never has to accept being treated as less valuable than other people, even by family members. I want her to know that standing up for yourself isn't mean or selfish, but necessary for maintaining your self-respect and teaching others how to treat you. Last week, Emily came over for dinner at Nana's house, and we had our most honest conversation yet. She apologized again for keeping David's secret, but this time she also acknowledged the broader patterns of competition and comparison that had defined our relationship for years. We talked about wanting to model a healthier sister relationship for Sophie and any children Emily might have in the future. We're not completely healed yet, and I'm not sure we ever will be in the way we might have been if we'd grown up with a mother who loved us equally. But we're building something new together, a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than competition for parental approval. As for David, he married Jessica 6 months after our divorce was finalized, and they moved to another state where he took a job with a marketing firm. He sees Sophie every other month and calls her regularly, but our interactions are cordial and brief. I feel nothing but indifference toward him now, which is perhaps the best possible outcome after such a painful betrayal. The truth is, my life now is smaller in some ways than what I had when I was married. I have less money, less security, fewer social connections. But it's also more authentic, more peaceful, and more aligned with my values. Sophie and I have dinner together every night, help Nana with her garden, and spend weekends exploring local parks and libraries. It's a quiet life, but it's honest in a way my previous existence never was. Sometimes I think about that moment in my grandmother's living room when my mother said she wished she'd only given birth to Emily. The comment was designed to destroy me, to put me in my place once and for all. Instead, it became the catalyst that freed me from decades of trying to earn love from someone who had already decided I wasn't worthy of it. I learned that day that you can't reason with cruelty, you can't earn respect from people who are determined to withhold it, and you can't heal relationships with people who refuse to acknowledge that they've caused damage. But you can choose to stop participating in your own diminishment. You can choose to walk away from situations that consistently harm your sense of self-worth. And you can choose to build a life that reflects your own values rather than desperately trying to meet someone else's impossible standards. The most surprising discovery has been that life without my mother's approval is not only possible, but actually quite peaceful. For 32 years, I'd been trying to solve the puzzle of how to make her love me as much as she loved Emily. It never occurred to me that the puzzle might be unsolvable, or that my energy might be better spent on relationships with people who were capable of appreciating me as I am. Sophie and I are planting a small garden in Nana's backyard this spring. We're going to plant vegetables and flowers, things that will grow strong and beautiful with proper care and attention. It seems like an appropriate metaphor for the life we're building together, rooted in honesty and nourished by genuine love. What happened at that family reunion taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. Sometimes standing up for yourself isn't selfish or dramatic, but necessary for your own emotional survival. And sometimes the truth really can set you free, even when it's painful for everyone involved. I still don't know if my relationship with my mother will ever fully heal, or if Emily and I will completely overcome the damage done by years of being pitted against each other. But I know that Sophie is growing up in a home where she's valued for who she is, rather than how she compares to others. And I know that I finally have the courage to choose relationships that nurture my soul rather than diminish it. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the permission to stop trying to earn love from people who have already decided you're not worth loving. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth about your own experience, even when that truth makes other people uncomfortable. Have you ever had to stand up to a family member who was treating you unfairly? How did you find the courage to speak your truth when it meant potentially damaging important relationships? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about family dynamics, personal growth, and finding the strength to advocate for yourself. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that they deserve to be treated with respect, even by their own family members. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that you are worthy of love and respect exactly as you are. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us unconditionally are the ones who struggle with it the most, but that's a reflection of their limitations, not your worth.